Hello everyone, thank you all for watching this recording. Unfortunately, when we tried to record this last Saturday on the 18th, my computer kind of crashed a couple times and Zoom did not record this session. So I'm coming afterwards to kind of record this video for everyone who wanted to watch the recording lecture. So you may miss some of the questions people were asking, but I will try to remember what I can from last Saturday and give it to you guys as it was kind of presented then. Before we begin though, can you please, if you haven't already, fill out this QR code. If you did fill it out the day of on Saturday, that is all okay. It's only one time, is all okay. Just please fill it out and make sure you're marking the watching a recording option. So this is Software Saturdays Fall 2021, the beginner track, lesson 1, which is going to be HTML and CSS. So as a quick reminder, the beginner track consists of 7 lessons. The first one is going to be HTML and CSS. Lesson 2 will be JavaScript. Lesson 3 will be the intro to Vue. Lesson 4 will be a bit more about Vue, kind of continuing on that. Then there'll be NoSQL databases, and at the very last second, there will be 2 project work days. So there is a lot of help available if you ever have any questions or any kind of doubts or about what we've learned so far. The first, of course, is obviously our weekly learning sessions every Saturday at 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. And of course, kind of going along with that, the recordings every Sunday. Well, supposedly every Sunday. Hopefully, if I can fix my computer problems, they'll be actually, being posted the day afterwards. And if you still need some more individual help, we have the open review hours every Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. These will be hosted on Zoom, so please just check the Slack for more information and just drop in whenever you need to. And again, these are open, so you can come in for as long or as little as you need and ask any questions. Please note that this is being shared with a Python course, so if you see some Python on the screen, don't be afraid, that's just a different student needing some help. And of course, we always are available on Slack. You can drop a question in either hashtag general discussion or in the hashtag fall 2021 Vue.js, and a mentor or I will try to respond within a couple hours at the latest. So as a quick reminder about teaching staff, there's obviously me, Hadi Ahmed, I'm the chair. I'm also a junior in Comp B. And our 3 wonderful mentors are Sam, Nishant, and John. If you attend in person, you'll see John helping me out in the beginner session, while Sam and Nishant help out teaching the intermediate section. So before we begin, I please ask that everyone has installed and has opened to kind of walk through this with us a text editor. There are many good options. I personally use Visual Studio Code, but you can use so many. There's Atom, there's VS Code, there's Sublime Text, there's Notepad++, or even Vim if you want to go more command line. Really, the best tool is the tool that works for you. So if you don't have it in mind, I recommend VS Code, but whatever tool you use, whether that be command line Vim or Nano or Emacs or whatever else, that's the best one. And if you want to follow along with our code and demo files, that's all be posted on our GitHub. The link is right there. As a quick reminder, here's what the page looks like, for example. All of the code for each lesson, or each week rather, will be posted to the particular branch for that week. So for example, if you click on this little drop down right here from master, you can see there are currently 2 branches. Since we are the beginner track, we'll be in lesson 1. So click on the lesson 1 tab, and that will take you to all of the demo code for lesson number 1. All right, with that in mind, let's get started. So part 1 is HTML. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And it uses the idea of tags to kind of represent elements on a website. Each tag has both an opening and a close. And you'll know that because the opening tags are going to have those little 2 angle brackets around the tag name, and the closing bracket will be the exact same as the opening bracket, so same name in between the angle brackets on screen there, but there'll be this little slash right before the closing tag. You'll see an example of that on a coming slide. This is very similar to XML, so if you're at all familiar with that kind of standard, HTML is almost the exact same. HTML is really used to describe layouts. So HTML defines the layout, the location, some basic styles, and the content of a web page. We then use CSS to add stuff like colors, stylings, fonts, borders. And at the very end, we use some JavaScript to add some user interactivity and some more dynamic capabilities to our site. So these next kind of 3 weeks are going to be kind of fundamental, going through the major components of a web page. So really, we're going to try to teach everyone the absolute basics to the absolute minimum you need to make a fully functioning modern web page in 2021. So here's a really quick basic HTML syntax. This is what a kind of page is going to look like for no matter what page you're making. And there's a couple things to note here. First one is, see the opening and closing tag structure. For example, this HTML here is the word surrounded by angle brackets to make it an open tag. And then the corresponding close tag down here is the same HTML with a slash in front of it. Now, it's important to note that in most cases, there are a couple we'll talk about later, but in most every case, each opening tag has to have a corresponding close tag. So you can see HTML opens and then closes. And there's a green line can show you to match up the opening and closing tags. So let's go through this file quickly line by line. The very first one, this doc type HTML, defines that the browser is about to receive and decode some HTML. It is important that this exists so the browser can properly render your page and not have to guess in case something is mistyped on your end. The actual word doc type does not have to be uppercase. It is convention but not required. It can be lowercase and all browsers will take it as regular HTML still. Then we actually have an opening, as you can see, tag here, and then the corresponding close tag, and that represents the actual HTML for your site. Meaning in between it is all of the code the browser will use to render the page. Within the HTML, there are two required sections, the head and the body. The head is mostly for your browser. It has metadata like links you're pulling in or style sheets or other scripts or things about like the author of the web page or like a sitemap or the title of the tab. Really stuff that is not important for the browser rendering, but is important for the browser to properly display the page and represent the content on the page. The actual layout is talked about in the body tag. So all of the work we're going to go over in this course will mostly, except for one small thing, all of it will occur in the body tag. So again, there's an opening and a closing body tag. So now let's talk about some of the basic tags. And as a reminder, all of these that we're going to talk about go inside of the body tag. And if there's a closing tag you see on screen here, there must also be an equivalent closing tag on your code. So the three most basic tags that almost every page is going to use in abundance is going to be the div, the h tag, and the p tags. So the divs are kind of like invisible groupings of other tags. That means that by themselves, they have no styling properties, but they're very useful for kind of grouping elements together into logical kind of organization of like a page. And you'll see an example of this, that why it might be useful when it comes to CSS, but a really useful case is in Vue, where we have one div act as like the parent root element for Vue, and we do all of our code within that one div. Now the second one is going to be the h tags. So the h will be followed by some number between 1 and 6 that kind of represent like bigger or smaller heading text. 1 is going to be the biggest and 6 is the smallest, which is really counterintuitive. But this is kind of similar to a word processor where your heading 1 will be your biggest heading and so on to the heading number 6 or 7 or 8, whatever. At the very end, there'll be paragraph text. You typically put all of your text that you need in logical paragraphs inside of the p tag, a paragraph text tag. It is important to note that the p tag and the h tags by extension will add space above and below your paragraph, kind of like a word processor. So it's really useful in case you want to make sure that you're having this huge like wall of text and it's easy to read. The p tag will kind of add that space in for you automatically. A couple of more important ones, you're going to have the UL, the OL, and the LI tags. So UL, or unordered list, is kind of like a bullet point list, like what you see on the screen here. On the other hand, OL is a numbered list or ordered list. And this is going to be like, the number 1, 2, and 3, kind of like that lecture that curriculum slide you showed earlier in this video here. The important thing to note is that every single element, so each bullet or each number, is must have be wrapped within a list item or list text tag. So for each bullet point you want to use, you're going to first create a bullet point with UL, and then have each bullet be a separate LI tag. And then same with the OL or numbered lists. This may seem a little bit confusing, but don't worry, we have a demo coming up that should explain this all pretty well. Speaking of demos, let's try to jump into demo program number 1. So as a reminder, all of our demo code will be on the GitHub, and if you can follow along or kind of copy from there if you want. So here is our first demo file, demo1.html, and this has all of the actual tags that we've talked about. So as you can see, we have the basic tags that our browser uses to display everything, and then the opening and the closing body tags to show how we are going to lay things out. So as you can see, in case you wanted to do this, here is how you do an HTML comment. We didn't cover this in the slides, but it's something important to realize. So the way you would do it is you put the exclamation point, like you put a doc type after the tag opening, but instead of doing the word doc type, you put 2 dashes. And then to close the tag, you just put 2 and then a this to close the comment. This comment is, you can tell it's a comment because it's green first of all, and this comment will be a multi-line comment. So we can instead say close the comment here like that, and the comment will be just like a normal block comment in other languages. Now here's an example of the H1 tag. As you can see, it's the letter H with a number 1 and the corresponding closing tag, and the text that you want to make appear in the heading appears in between the 2 tags. We do the same thing for the H3 tag, so we expect this one to be smaller than the H1 tag. And finally, we have just a regular paragraph. Now note this div here is not necessarily required. You don't need this div. You can delete it if you want to. We have it here to show you that when we display this on the screen, there will be no visual indicator that the div tag exists. And inside this div, we have 2 lists. So on the point I was talking about earlier about list items, you can see that we open up the unordered and the ordered lists, and then we also then, to make each bullet or each number appear, we have the text for the bullet in between an li nested, or it's called, underneath. One thing to note is that you can have what's called child tags or nested tags. They kind of mean the exact same thing. So child or nested tags are going to be basically tags that are inside of another tag before that tag closes. So for example, this li tag is nested underneath this ul tag, which closes down here, and this ul tag is nested underneath the div tag because we close it down here. This is extremely useful because it allows you to kind of stack elements in very interesting ways to make some pretty cool web pages. Now, how do I run this code? Well, the quickest way to run HTML is to actually just go and open up in your file explorer the folder direction we're currently in. So we're in this folder right here, and then double click on the HTML file and select open with the browser in case that appears. So here's an example of that code we just shot earlier, and you can see that there's a big text for H1, the smaller H3, and then the bullet points appear with the paragraph text and the numbered items. Also note that there is spacing. HTML automatically adds spacing in between these individual elements. So in case you can't tell why it's either too much or too little space, maybe think about how much default spacing exists from the HTML renderer. Okay, hope that was a good example of how to do some of the basic HTML tags. So here are a couple more HTML tags that we want to talk about that you'll definitely be using in your project and just some general use cases. The first one here is image or img. This shows an image on the page, as the name might suggest. And do note that this one is called a self-closing tag, meaning there does not need to be a closing tag because no text can go inside of an image. So you'll notice that there's only an opening tag and the slash is at the very end. This slash is optional. Actually I think most, if not all, modern web browsers will render just fine if you don't include that trailing slash. But please do not put a closing tag because that may indeed break if you do it in the wrong way. There's also the button tag, which adds a clickable button. Now this clickable button will not be able to do much until we add some JavaScript next week. So you can see what it looks like and how to style it properly, but you can't actually use it until a little bit later, unfortunately. Third, there's the BR or line break tag. This is kind of like adding a \n or a new line in another programming language. So if you want to add some more space between things, a BR tag is always a great option. And finally, there's the A or anchor tag. This is kind of what makes a hyperlink or like a blue underlined text appear on your page, and you can click on it to take you to some other web page. Now note, if you with the way you can do with the A tag, you can have the text appear as one thing, but the link point to another. You see this all the time on the web, and we'll go over that in just a second to show how you can make that happen. I'm going to skip ahead one slide and come back in 1 second, but really I want to talk about HTML attributes before this. So HTML attributes provide additional information that allow us to control the behavior of that element. What that means is in the starting tag of any element, so the opening tag, we can put some attribute name in $, and then the value in quotes, and that tag will have some extra behavior or additional styling information or a whole bunch of extra things. Some of those things, for example, are with the A or anchor tag are in href. So href stands for hypertext reference, and it specifies the location of an external resource. What that means is the user will see a W3, like right here, in between from the A tags, as blue text underlining a normal hyperlink. And when they click on it, it will take them to wherever the href points. In this case, this URL right here. A couple more, and you can see on this image tag, you have source, alt, width, and height. So width and height are pretty explanatory. They are just the width and height of an image. Please note that this is going to be the default unit, which is pixels or px. You'll see that later. So this image here is 500 pixels by 600 pixels. Also note that the browser will automatically scale the image to fit the width and the height. So always know the size of your image and the aspect ratio ahead of time. Otherwise, the browser might warp your image and it might look very wrong to the end user. The other two important tags for images are source and alt. So source or SRC is a very common abbreviation for it. Will specify the URL or the location of an image that it wants to embed at that location. So in this case, we're looking for the street.jpg file on our server. The alt is used in case the image fails to load for maybe a broken, a dead link, or maybe the user has a bad network connection and they can't load the image. In both of those cases, the browser will instead display the alt text. So it is always important to make sure your image tags have descriptive and filled in alt tags, so the user always knows what you were trying to display. Another extremely important and less talked about reason why you should always have alt tags is because if someone out there, which is very common, is blind or hard of seeing and is using a screen reader to look to your website, the screen readers will always describe the image based on what it sees inside of the alt attribute. As a result, I highly recommend and actually will require for the final project that you make sure every image tag has an alt text, since it makes your site more accessible for both people with bad internet and disabilities. To jump back a few slides really quick, I last want to talk about the head tag. So previously we talked about how the head tag in the very top of the page really defines properties and metadata for your browser. With that in mind, there are only two tags that we're going to expect you to know in this lesson. Actually, in this course rather. And those two are title and link. Title is the title of the web page, like the browser title, and link is the actual used to kind of gather and bring in other CSS files and other kind of files you might see, the most common of which is CSS. So don't worry about that too much for now. We'll cover that in the CSS portion of this lecture today. With that in mind, let's go into demo program number 2. So here is demo program number 2. As you guys can see, the page looks very similar to last time. Now, looking here in this head tag, we have a title, meaning the tab, the actual browser tab, will now say Lesson 1 Demo 2, whereas before, it probably just had the file name, in this case, demo1.html. Now, within the body tag, you can see that we have the same h1ht structure, but we have added this image tag. Now, the image tag, as you can see, has both a source, an alt, and this new attribute called a title. So source, as I talked about before, just pulls in the image, which is right here. It'll be this logo file. And the alt is going to be what text displays if the image is not existent or broken or hard to load. And title is a little bit fancier. That is the hover text, meaning when you hover over the image, that is what will appear to the on the cursor basically. And here's also an example of that A tag. So we should see the word link, and that will, when you click on it, take us to the Software Saturdays homepage at this URL. Finally, there's a button. The button won't do anything right now, but it will look nice. And finally, we'll see that this line has a line break, meaning there will be a single new line in between a giant block of text and this lorem ipsum body here. So again, we click on Demo 2 to display it in our browser, and you can see the page looks just as we might expect it. The image loads, the link takes us to the Software Saturdays page, and the block of text indeed has this line here and a new line because there's a line break in between. The button is also here. Again, it does nothing, but it does there. And we can show the alt text by just making this link broken. So maybe instead of saying IEEE, we mistype and say only IEEE. Now, when we reload this page, you will see that the image no longer exists, and instead the alt text is displayed. Again, this is because the image failed to load, and so the web browser is displaying the alt text as a catch-up, as like a remediation measure, basically. Also, look at the title. This title here is Lesson 1 Demo 2, whereas the Demo 1 is just the actual file path for the browser. Please note that if you're using Chrome, this may look a bit different since the two browsers are a little bit different in how they display things, but the behavior at the end of it may look the exact same, even if some of the styling choices, because I'm using Mozilla Firefox on Linux, are a little bit different. Okay. I hope that was a pretty good demo of some of the more interesting Demo 2s. So as a quick reminder, we really only went over the absolute basics right now. There are so many other tags that you can use, including videos, formatting tags, frames, and a whole bunch of other ones. And if you want a good reference, I highly recommend the link you see here. This is a great tutorial on how to use HTML. With that in mind, let's take a brief moment here and work on checkpoint number 1. So checkpoints you'll see scattered across our lectures from time to time, typically after about halfway of our material. And these checkpoints are just ways to make sure that you can apply what we've learned from practice in applications. These are not required to be turned in or for grade or anything like that. These are solely for your own understanding. And I highly recommend that you do the checkpoints and get the help in case you are not fully getting it, because all of the information will build on each other as you move through this course. So checkpoint 1 for this lesson is going to be creating a website with a list of tasks. This is actually exactly what you'll be doing for your final project, so it's a pretty good practice on how to do it. Each task should have a link and some text describing the task. I don't particularly care where the link points to, as long as you can prove to both me and yourself, is the important one here, that you know how to create a link and have the link text appear differently than the actual link it's pointing to. So pause the video now and take a brief moment to work on this task. Okay. Let's move forward to part 2, which is going to be CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And really it describes how to style HTML tags to make them look nicer and more modern, and actually any kind of way you want them to, and to be more generic here. It makes formatting really simple and very easy to read, although it can be complicated to figure out exactly which combination of styles will help you achieve the look that you want. So CSS consists of groups of similar or dissimilar HTML tags that all have the same styling that we give it. Each group is given these instructions in the CSS file. So on a quick tangent here, I'll come back to CSS in a moment. We have something to talk about classes and IDs. So these are very important in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, so it's worth mentioning right now. An ID is used to give a unique name to an element. This element, only one element on each page can have that unique ID. This is extremely useful since you might have multiple items, multiple H1 or P tags, but you want to link to one or want to refer to one in particular. You can use the ID to do that. As an example, on the bottom left here, we can see some basic IDs given to these little tags here. So note that the top H1 tag is given an ID of 1, an ID 1, and the div is given ID 2. Remember, the name in between the quotes does not have to be ID 1. It can in fact be any text starting with a number that you want. Not number, but starting with a letter that you want, an English letter. Now, it is maybe what the convention for naming it will depend on your site, but ID 1, ID 2 here are just examples and are not the only way to do it. On the other hand, you have classes. So classes can be used to identify a group of elements. All of these elements will now share the exact same styling instructions and can all be referred to in one big group. This can be very useful if you have a lot of similar items on your page, like a bunch of different buttons or kind of paragraphs and different maybe headers that you all want to be either look the same or be referred to by the same class. As you can see here, the H1 and div tag from before now have classes, and the class name is the exact same, whereas in the ID they had to be unique. Once again, the name class 1 here is an example. It can be any string you want to give it, no spaces, that's the only requirement, no spaces, provided that the name begins with an English letter. Class 1 is just an example here. Now, going back to CSS, CSS has 3 kinds of groupings available for us to use. The first one is tag-based grouping, where the CSS styles tags, whole tags, like for example H1s or P tags. There's also a class group where you style classes that we talked about earlier. And finally, you have ID groups, where you only style one particular ID. Like we saw earlier, an ID can only refer to one element. Now, it is important to note that CSS groups will apply the styling to any nested or child tag. So that means, to go back to an earlier slide, if we were to style this class 1, both the div h2 and p tag would receive the same styling. And it is oftentimes possible and common to make an HTML element belong to multiple CSS groups. So to add some CSS to your page is very simple. You use that link tag, which we talked about earlier, in the head of your image, and what you do is you put 2 HTML attributes, rel or relationship, and href. Rel, I like to think of it as relationship, is kind of telling the browser what kind of file you're pulling in from some kind of other resource. In CSS will always be style sheet because CSS is a style sheet. Again, cascading style sheets. And second, the href. That is just, again, the location of which you want to pull in the file. So in this case, we're going to pull in the file1.css file from our server. Now, one thing to note is that the word C in CSS, or cascading, means that you can have multiple CSS files. is actually very common and very, very practical to do this. And as a result, it is important to know what each file contains so you don't have any unforeseen situations. Now, one last little thing about syntax before we talk about properties. The basic CSS syntax is you have a basic kind of 4 parts. The first one will be the name of the group you want to style. This can either be the name of the tag, in this case h1 in this example here, or the name of the class, or the name of the ID. You then have an opening bracket, and then all inside that opening bracket you put all of the styling instructions. We'll go over those in a little bit. After you finish, you put a closing bracket. Now, the general format for all of CSS styling is you put the name of the instruction, the name of the property, a colon, and then the value for that property. In this case, the color will be blue. At the very end, you must put a semicolon to indicate that property is done. Now, CSS does not care about a new line or indentation, but I highly recommend that you do indent things to make it easier for your eyes to understand what is happening. So here is how to do all of the 3 groups as a quick overview. So for the tag groups, you just put the name of the tag, in this case h1 or h2. Do not put it inside angle brackets. The angle brackets here are just used to describe that you have to replace this entire block of text with the name of your tag. For class groups, you put a period and then the class group name. And finally, for an ID group, you put a hash symbol and then your ID group name. So here are some of the most basic and useful style options you will probably use. Color, as the name suggests, is the color of the text. Background color is the color of the background. Font size will give the size of the font in px or pixels. It is important to note here that pixels are very different from the points that you might use on a word processor. However, the default browser is typically going to be somewhere around 12 to 16 pixels, and that will be roughly equivalent to 12-point font. I say roughly and about because, again, every browser and every operating system are different, so I can't say definitively one way or the other. Font family is how you determine what kind of font is being used. And text alignment will be the actual, alignment left to right, center justified for the text. And finally, margin is going to be how much space is on each 4 sides of an element. Once again, the default unit is going to be pixels or px. There's one more property you might find useful called padding, which is kind of like margin, but instead of being space on the outside of an element, will be space on the inside of an element. So let's see some CSS. So here's the demo3 file, and you can see I pull in my CSS file because of my link tag at the very top here. And we here have a couple things. The first one is this div where we style it with class example. We also then have another div with the words ID example, and at the very bottom another div, this time with both class example and class 2. There is a space to show that these are 2 different classes. Because of this reason, you cannot use a space in your class name. Now, if we look at the CSS file, I have it open up on a new side-by-side screen here. We'll see that the h1 tag should be text color blue. Class example, so the 2 divs like that, will have the font size 18 and the font family of Helvetica and then sans serif. So with font family, you can actually specify multiple fonts, and the browser will first try to find the very first font on your computer. Now, Helvetica is a very commonly used font, so it'll probably be installed, but something like Wingdings, maybe not. As a result, it's always good to have a backup font. In this case, our backup font is going to be sans serif. Now, the HTML spec requires that every browser has at least 2 fonts, and the 2 required fonts are sans serif, as you see here, and serif. Serif is kind of like Times New Roman. If somehow everything fails, which is unlikely since, at least sans serif or serif will be defined, the browser will default to a generic serif font. So if you want to instead put a different font here in this list, you totally could, not a problem. Then there'll be class 2. Class 2 will change the background color to gray. And if you prefer the British spelling of gray, like G-R-A-Y or G-R-E-Y for the American spelling, or whichever way it goes, you can use either one. The CSS standard allows you to use both gray and the American or British gray, depending upon your preferred spelling. Both will work fine. However, the word color still has to be spelled like an American. Finally, ID example, as you can see, will have the text line to be centered and the color kind of this ugly yellow-green. So if we open up our file here, you'll see that all the styles we thought were true. The H1 tags are blue, the ID is now dark, it's kind of yellow-green, and the font for the two divs are this nice big serif font. And that second class is going to have a gray font. A background color of gray. My bad, my apologies here. All right. So time for checkpoint number 2, but actually before that, we're kind of going to do the last kind of wrap-up slides that we did in the class. So first, there are a lot of CSS properties, and we only went over really the absolute basics here today. A lot of very popular other examples are going to be underlines, borders, and margins, and a full reference can be found at the second link here. If you click on it, you'll see that there are a lot of properties, and you can kind of scroll through these at your leisure and see how to make websites look exactly the way that you want them to. And you can do some pretty advanced stuff with some CSS. A good tutorial is this first link here, kind of like the HTML one I talked about earlier. So here's a quick demo of the final project so you can see what we're building to over the entire semester. This final project is indeed public for everyone to look at, so you can totally look at this all you want in your own time. So to do beginner is going to be like so. You can make new tasks. So we'll say I will say learn HTML, and we'd add it to a task list. We could say edit, because I forgot to say, and CSS, and we can save it. And then we can also say, you know what, I think we finished this task. So we hit mark as done, and I'll put it on the bottom finished to-do list. From within, we can also delete tasks, like say we finished this website, we're good. Or we can delete and restore to-do items. For example, restore, we'll put it back in our list, and then delete, we'll delete it from our entire thing altogether. Please note that this demo here does not have any database integration, but the demo, that the actual project you create, will be attached to a database. So each of those actions will actually sustain themselves across a page refresh. If you prefer to see what the intermediate level is doing, just change this beginner here to intermediate and it'll be just the same. So as a quick final note here, thank you all for listening to us lecture here. Please fill out the feedback form you see here. The link is going to be on the slide in Slack. We really love feedback to make sure that we know what we can do to improve ourselves for the coming weeks and make sure that your experience here is as useful to you as possible. If you have any questions, please ask us at our open review hours on Wednesday or put a message on Slack. With that in mind, let's go back to our checkpoint. The checkpoint for you to finish off with today is going to be creating some CSS files to add to that to-do list you made in checkpoint number 1. This can be something like changing the color, making each item have a little border around it, or whatever you think you want to do. It's really, again, not required. It's just solely how to make sure you understand what you are doing. I hope you will enjoy your lecture here today. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed kind of giving this presentation here, and I hope to see everyone back in the classroom or online on Saturday for our next lesson. Thanks and have a great week.